The holographic projector hummed, a low-frequency vibration that Kalen felt in his marrow more than he heard with his ears. He stood in the center of the obsidian spire, the floor beneath his boots polished to a mirror finish that reflected his own scarred, weary face back at him. Empress Valerie sat atop her crystalline throne, her skin glowing with the soft, ethereal light of the lumina, looking down at him as if he were a curious insect. He didn't blink. He didn't look away. Instead, he reached for the control on his wrist, his fingers steady despite the phantom ache of the Rigel shrapnel buried in his shoulder. "I am not afraid of you," Kalen said, his voice a dry rasp that cut through the perfumed air of the throne near room. "I am afraid of what made me." The Empress leaned forward, a thin, mocking smile playing on her lips. To her he was a flicker of candlelight, brief, fragile, and destined to be snuffed out by the passage of a few decades. She had lived for centuries. She had seen empires rise and fall while her people remained untouched behind their shimmering energy shields. To the hegemony, humanity was a loud, violent accident that hadn't yet realized its own insignificance. But it hadn't always been this way. 3 hours earlier, Kalen had been jolted from a dreamless sleep by a high-priority summons. The moons of Onyx Prime hung heavy in the sky, 3 jagged crescents of bone-white rock, casting long, distorted shadows across the military compound. He had dressed in silence, the familiar weight of his dress uniform feeling heavier than his tactical gear ever had. He knew why he was being called. The hegemony was pushing for integration, a polite term for the systematic dismantling of human sovereignty in exchange for a peace that felt more like a cage. The walk to the spire had been a gauntlet of silent judgment. Lumina guards, tall and graceful with weapons that looked more like jewelry than tools of war, watched him pass with detached amusement. They saw his prosthetic eye, the jagged line of skin across his jaw, and the way he favored his left side. They saw a broken thing. "You speak of fear, Commander," Valerie said, her voice like melodic chimes. "But look at you. You are a collection of mishaps and biological failures. Your kind burns through resources and lives with a recklessness that borders on the divine. Why should we treat with a species that cannot even master its own mortality?" Kalen took a step forward, the click of his heels echoing against the crystal walls. A prison of invisible walls is still a prison, regardless of the peace it claims. You offer us safety, but you demand we forget who we are to get it. "And who are you exactly?" she countered, gesturing to the vast star-strewn sky visible through the spire's heights. "A handful of systems, a fleet of metal boxes? You are a rounding error in the history of the hegemony." Kalen felt the heat rising in his chest, not as anger, but as a cold, hard clarity. He thought of the siege of Rigel, the way the sky had turned black with soot, the way the ground had stayed warm for weeks from the sheer friction of the bombardment. He remembered the faces of the people who hadn't made it off the surface because they were too busy holding the line. 28 victories, Your Majesty," Kalen whispered, and the projector on his wrist flared into life. "We have fought 28 defensive wars since we left our cradle, and we have not yet learned how to lose." The air in the throne room chilled as the holographic display expanded, bleeding crimson and charcoal gray light across the Empress's translucent skin. This wasn't the polished propaganda of the hegemony. It was raw sensor data from the Rigel line, grainy, flickering and terrifyingly silent. Dalaris recoiled slightly as the image of a human destroyer appeared. It wasn't a sleek vessel. It was a jagged, scarred hunk of pressurized steel, venting atmosphere like a dying lung. On the bridge, humans were not standing in stoic poses. They were bleeding, shouting, and tethering themselves to consoles as the hull buckled under a barrage that would have shattered a Lumina shield in seconds. "The cost of glory is a bill we pay in blood, while you hide behind crystal walls," Kalen said. His voice remained low, but it filled the cavernous hall. "You see our short lives as a weakness? You think our scars are failures of biology. But every mark on my skin is a reminder that we chose to stay when the universe told us to run." He swiped his hand, and the display shifted. It showed the final moments of the 28th war. A massive hegemony-class dreadnought, captured by an insurgent force decades ago, had been bearing down on the civilian colony. The recording showed 3 human interceptors, tiny, fragile needles, against a mountain of light deliberately accelerating. They didn't fire. They didn't seek a tactical exit. They simply merged their engines with the dreadnought's primary core. The explosion was a silent, blinding white bloom on the holographic field. They knew they wouldn't see the sunrise, Kalen whispered, staring at the dissipating light. They didn't have centuries of life to gamble with. They had maybe 40 years left, and they gave every second of it away so that people they would never meet could breathe for one more day. That is the mathematics of humanity, Your Majesty. We are the only species that refuses to let fear dictate our surrender. Valerice looked from the dying hologram to the man standing before her. For the first time, the mocking curve of her lips flattened. She looked at his prosthetic eye, not as a mechanical blemish, but as a trophy of a survival she couldn't comprehend. Her people lived in a vacuum of safety, a stagnant peace bought by avoiding anything that could actually hurt them. Unsettling, she finally admitted, her glow dimming to a deeper, more contemplative amber. You treat your existence as a weapon. It's the only one we have that actually works against time, Kalen replied. He shut off the projector, plunging the room back into the soft, artificial twilight of the spire. We don't want your protection, Empress. We want your respect. We want a seat at the table where the terms aren't surrender or extinction. Because if you try to build a wall around us, we will find a way to break it. Not because we're stronger, but because we're willing to break ourselves to do it. The silence that followed was heavy, vibrating with the weight of a shifted paradigm. Valerie stood, her robes whispering against the crystal floor. She didn't signal the guards. She didn't dismiss him. Instead, she walked down the steps of her dais until she was standing on the same level as the soldier. The hegemony has lived in fear of the chaos outside our borders for an eternity, she said softly. Perhaps it is time we learned how to walk through it. Tell your leaders the integration talks are over. We shall begin negotiations for a mutual defense treaty instead. Kalen felt the tension in his shoulders finally snap. He didn't smile. There was too much ghost ache in his joints for that. But he nodded. As he turned to leave the obsidian spire, the Lumina guards didn't watch him with amusement anymore. They watched him with a strange, burgeoning shadow of awe. He stepped out into the night of Onyx Prime, the 3 moons still hanging cold and distant. He was still scarred, still tired, and his life was still a heartbeat compared to the stars. But as he walked back toward the human camp, his stride was certain. Humanity hadn't learned how to lose yet, and tonight they weren't going to start.